The United States spent a staggering $766 billion on its military during the 2022 fiscal year, and the simple fact is that this number will never decrease. If anything, it's only gonna rise higher. That should come as no surprise to anybody who realizes that running and protecting a global superpower doesn't come cheap. And yet, many people want cuts in military spending. According to the American Friends Service Committee, or AFSC, 56% of Americans would support a decrease in the Pentagon's budget. The conclusion we can draw from this is that Americans, at least a slim majority of them, want to spend less on warfare. But desire doesn't match capability in the US, and it's the lack of ability to lower the budget that gets in the way. Even policymakers who support spending less will find a host of issues that will not only force the budget to stay as it is, but will result in it rising as time goes on. Those issues start with America's approach to maintaining its global military might. Going back through history, you'll see tale after tale of the rise and fall of massive empires. The Mongols, the Romans, the British, they all had empires, some spanning the entire world, that they achieved through global conquest, colonization, and subjugation. All of those empires failed for many reasons, though they can generally be boiled down to a simple fact: maintaining a truly global presence is so resource-intensive that it eventually becomes impossible. Now, the United States has obviously taken a different approach to those empires in terms of building its own global presence. Rather than conquering other countries to bring them under American control, it's instead worked hard to foster relationships that allow it to maintain its presence. The approach has worked wonders, as statistics from Al Jazeera demonstrate. It says that the US currently maintains around 750 military bases spread across 80 countries. On top of that, it has nearly 175,000 troops deployed in 159 countries. Why does that matter? On the strategic side, it gives the US global coverage, which ensures it can maintain its military presence across the world. Its bases aren't signs of military dominance over the countries in which they're located. They're actually signs of cooperation. The US has cleverly established these bases as protective forces, both for itself and the countries they're located in, allowing it to build stronger ties with dozens of other nations. Of course, America benefits too. It gets to maintain a global presence to the point where it has troops and equipment available to respond to combat-related issues quickly, practically anywhere in the world. But these bases also matter because they cost money. Every single one needs to be maintained and staffed, creating a cumulative cost of about $55 billion per year, according to the International Institute for Strategic Studies, or IISS. Far from the isolationist approach the US took in the years leading up to World War II, this establishment of so many international bases highlights a desire to essentially control territory far outside of its own borders. And even in the wake of President Trump, who fostered an America First attitude, those bases have remained and will likely continue to stand for many years to come. Immediately, we see an expenditure that isn't going away anytime soon. The US is spending about 1/12 of its military budget, according to the IISS, annually to maintain those bases. And that expenditure may increase further should America need to equip these bases with new weapons or more troops. Having an empire, even one that's built on cooperation rather than colonization, is an expensive prospect. Consolidation of some of those bases would help to save a little bit of money, the IISS says, but those savings would be offset, at least in the short term, by the need to adapt bases to accept more personnel. But even if a consolidation program took place, the simple fact is the US wants to maintain the global presence it established in the wake of 9/11, meaning it's going to have to keep spending money to do so. And frankly, it may have to keep those bases running. If a new Cold War erupts, the US will have to maintain footholds in many countries that could allow it to attack China. We mentioned China because several commentators believe that a Cold War with Beijing is on the horizon, if it hasn't already started, that is. Brookings points to intensifying competition between the US and China as the spark for this war, with countries duking it out on multiple fronts as they try to maintain their positions at the head of the geopolitical table. The countries' economies are ranked number 1 and number 2 in the world. Same goes for military spending. China's government spends about $298 billion on its military per year, according to China Power. Over the last 2 decades, China has transformed from being something of an emerging power in global geopolitics to the biggest rival the United States has seen since the Soviet Union. During its conflict with the Soviet Union, the US followed a containment strategy. Proxy wars spread all over the world followed, leaving millions of people dead in their wake. But the strategy was effective. The US and the Soviet Union never entered a direct war, and eventually the Soviet Union crumbled. Thankfully, there are fundamental differences between China and the old Soviet Union, where the communist leaders of the Soviet Union saw democracy and capitalism, and thus the United States, as enemies of their worldview. The leadership of China doesn't consider other democracies as opposing its aims. Yes, China is growing increasingly authoritarian, but it's not looking to conquer the world so that all other countries fall under its rule. The Chinese government is smarter than that. It believes power starts at home, with the country being slow to adopt any sort of fair economic exchanges, much to the benefit of its own industries. It controls information flow within the country and is focused more on using its increasing wealth to help smaller countries, often in the form of loans for infrastructure projects, thus expanding its influence through something akin to America's cooperative approach. Additionally, the US and China share such deep economic ties that a direct war between the two would be disastrous to both countries. None of that changes the fact that China isn't just seeking to be a global superpower. It wants to be the global superpower. And that means that the United States is going to have to spend a lot of its time keeping up with the Joneses, or as the case is right now, staying ahead of the Joneses. And that's going to be a difficult and expensive process. Take the military spending of China as an example. Right now, Beijing is spending a little over a third of the amount that the US spends every year. In competition for global supremacy, that would appear to mean that the US has some wiggle room to decrease its military spending without giving up too much ground to China. But that isn't the case. In a 2022 speech delivered during the Government Contracting Pricing Summit, Major General Cameron Holt said that China gets a lot more bang for its military buck than the United States. Holt, who is part of the U.S. Air Force's Acquisition, Technology, and Logistics Office, claimed that the U.S. has to spend $20 for every $1 China spends to achieve the same capability. That's a problem. China may be spending less, but it can stretch its money much further, with Holt claiming that this purchasing power disparity could lead to the U.S. losing its arms race with Beijing if it doesn't find a way to reduce the cost of the weapons it acquires. As the new Cold War heats up, the U.S. may not find itself conducting as many proxy wars as it did against the Soviet Union, but it may find itself having to find a way to keep up with the ever-increasing pace of China's military ambitions, which would make reducing its own military spending an impossibility. After all, China's military grows by the year, and if it's able to maintain a situation where it's getting 20 times more for every dollar that it spends than the US, it won't be long before it surpasses America in military strength. The US can't allow that to happen, so it has to keep spending to stay ahead of China. But sadly, it'll also be extremely difficult to rein in spending by cutting the cost of its own weapons, because inefficiency is rife in America's military-industrial complex. In May 2023, the Arms Control Association, or ACA, published an article about the U.S. Sentinel program. This program is for a new type of intercontinental ballistic missile, ICBM, that'll eventually replace the aging Minuteman III stock of ICBMs the U.S. has maintained since the 1960s. It's an expensive project and one that was supposed to see the new Sentinel missiles reach a goal of active deployment in May 2029. That is not going to happen. The ACA said that the program, which already has a $96 billion budget, is going to run over by at least 2 years. It also pointed out that the Pentagon requested an additional $3.7 billion for continued research into the project, in addition to $539 million for procurement of the Sentinel system for the 2024 fiscal year. In short, it's looking like the Sentinel ICBMs are going to arrive late and over budget, which showcases the state of the U.S. and its spending on new equipment in a nutshell. But why was the Sentinel's budget so high in the first place? In May 2020, the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists dug deeper into why so many of the Pentagon's projects tend to go so drastically over budget. It unearthed information about the Ground-Based Strategic Deterrent Program, which would replace America's current stock of ICBMs. We now know that this program resulted in the commencement of the Sentinel project. At the time, the Pentagon's estimate said the project would take at least $85 billion to complete. So the Sentinel is already $11 billion past the estimate, with the budget seeming to grow by the year. But more worryingly, the article pointed out that there was practically no competition in the tendering process for the project. The bulletin said that Boeing decided the project wasn't the right call back in the summer of 2019. leaving only Northrop Grumman as a bidder. In a one-horse race, a military contractor can basically name its price, with the taxpayer ultimately getting the shaft because America simply can't cut the best deal possible for its weapons. It's an approach that is remarkably monopolistic, the antithesis of what capitalism is supposed to be, and it's an approach that the Pentagon has taken for years. Back in August 2011, the Center for Public Integrity, or CPI, published an article that looked into the windfalls of war. It pointed to another example of the Pentagon's wasteful spending, albeit on a smaller scale. During America's war in Afghanistan, improvised explosive devices, IEDs, were becoming a major problem. But it was a problem that apparently had a solution. Applied Energetics, a Tucson-based manufacturer, had come up with a clever weapon that shot beams of light at IEDs, destroying them where they stood. The Pentagon was impressed. So impressed, in fact, it awarded Applied Energetics with around $50 million in military contracts for its, quote, lightning weapon, all of which it received, with no tendering or bidding process. If no other company manufactured a competing product, that wouldn't be too much of a problem. But in Indiana, a company named Extreme Alternative Defense Systems had come up with its own lightning-based bomb disposal unit, and it had done so at a fraction of the price, $1.5 million. It didn't even get a look in. The Pentagon kept awarding contracts to Applied Energetics without so much as glancing at the competition. Not until August 2013 did the Marine Corps cancel a $3 million order of the device because a unit commander decided that it didn't actually meet their needs. So the Pentagon had shelled out $50 million on bomb disposal equipment that those in the field felt wasn't fit for the purpose. And they'd done so without holding any sort of competitive bidding process, destroying any chance of getting the unit, or even a better one, for a cheaper price. At the time, it was just one in a multitude of no-bid contracts, with the CPI pointing out that those types of contracts had tripled during a decade of war overseas. Here we see a pair of problems coalescing. First, the lack of competitive bidding explains why the US experiences such a massive pricing disparity compared to China. It's spending $20 for every Chinese dollar, in part because so many of its military contracts have a single bidder. Competition doesn't exist. The winning, or the only bid, gets to name a price and the Pentagon has to pay it. Second, there's the sole source problem. Once a contractor wins one of those no-bid projects, it becomes the sole supplier of that technology. We saw this with Applied Energetics, which managed to cash $50 million before the Pentagon realized that its lightning system wasn't doing the intended job. And we'll see it with the Sentinel. Only one company knows how to make it. Given that it's the only option the US has for its new ICBMs, the military is now tied to a contract, not just for the delivery of the system, but for the ongoing maintenance of its warheads from now until the Sentinel is eventually replaced. We see these issues appear time and time again in military spending. If they're not no-bid contracts, they're cost-plus contracts. With these deals, the Pentagon sets a budget with the proviso that the manufacturer can go above and beyond that budget, if needed, to deliver the weapon the military wants. The Pentagon is essentially signing blank checks. It's no surprise then that contractors are taking advantage of the fact by asking for more money and delaying their projects, prompting even further spending, while the US can do little more than keep the cash flowing. As for those manufacturers, none of them are going anywhere. Again, the crazy system the Pentagon has set up ensures that fact. Imagine this possibility. Despite all the money it's received for the Sentinel missile program, Northrop Grumman runs into financial trouble. It's right on the verge of bankruptcy and will go under if it's not able to get its hands on some cash quickly. But it has an ace in the hole. It's the sole source for the tech and parts that go into the Sentinel missile program, meaning that the Pentagon can't afford to let Northrop Grumman go out of business. It needs the company. Without it, the Sentinel program lies in tatters, with another company likely having to spend years educating itself on the missile system just to resume production and maintenance. Northrop Grumman is too important to fail, so a few billion more dollars get siphoned into the Sentinel project, keeping the company afloat and forcing the US to spend even more than it's anticipated on its new missile system. Or the Pentagon commissions a new weapon from Northrop Grumman, creating another no-bid contract and increasing reliance on the company, tying its own interests even deeper into the success of a private enterprise. Either way, Northrop Grumman keeps making money. It has the Pentagon over a barrel because it's the only company capable of delivering a project that has already received tens of billions of dollars in investment. As such, the Pentagon has to keep spending more, destroying the possibility of reducing its spending, at least on that particular project. Now, if this was a one-off, it might not be a huge issue. But practically every military manufacturer enjoys the fruits of this hypothetical situation. Boeing is too big for the Pentagon to allow it to fail. Lockheed Martin manufactures so much weaponry that the Pentagon needs it to succeed. If the Pentagon allows any of these private companies to collapse, its military will suddenly find itself dealing with supply shortages, all of which would see it giving up even more ground to China or any other country that has eyes on global supremacy. So the military budget doesn't go down. It can't, due to the Pentagon's spending policies and the illusion of competitive private industry that really just gives manufacturers free rein to spend as much as they need on the systems the military requests. But there are more reasons the spending won't go down. And as with so much related to the US military in the 2020s, it comes down to the war in Ukraine. The Council on Foreign Relations, CFR, says that the US has committed over $75 billion to the war effort since February 2022. As of this video's production, that aid has come in the form of direct financial help as well as humanitarian aid and military support. It's the latter that is the most obvious issue for the Pentagon. Every dollar it spends in Ukraine is a dollar that needs to be recouped by America to maintain its own defenses. Every missile sent over, every gun, every bullet, it all comes out of America's stockpile, with the Pentagon having to spend money to replenish that stockpile. All told, the CFR says that the US has sent $23.5 billion in weapons, along with spending $18.3 billion on security assistance, which includes training and equipment. That's a total of $41.8 billion, a significant chunk of America's military budget. It's not money that the US can ever hope to recoup. Ukraine won't be able to pay it back, essentially making each piece of equipment delivered a donation that the US funds itself. America is also sending tons of equipment to Israel. At least that's according to the New Arab, which claims that America has supplied 10,000 tons of arms and weaponry to Israel since the start of the latter's fight with Hamas. It amounts to 159 tons of weapons per day between October 7th and the article's December 8th publishing date. And guess what needs to happen for all that weaponry? It needs to be replenished. The US simply can't afford to let go of these weapons without replacing them, especially given the desire to stay ahead of China as a military power. Every single war effort that it supports overseas is a drain on America's own military, with more spending being the only solution. After all, the US can't simply choose not to support countries that align with its goals. If it stops sending weapons to Ukraine, it sends a message to Putin that he can run roughshod over other European countries. America's global influence would wane, Russia's would grow. That runs counter to the entire approach of cooperative empire building that we spoke about at the beginning of the video. To maintain the strong ties that allow the US to have such an expansive global presence, it has to spend big when war erupts, placing further burdens on itself and creating yet another reason why America's military budget can't go down. And of course, the US always has to keep one eye pointed to the future. Who might it have to fight next? What weapons are they building? And are those weapons better than what America has right now? Because if they are, then the US has to go and find something that's bigger and stronger, meaning it'll have to spend even more money. In other words, America can't afford to let its military stagnate. It can't rely on what it's built before to carry it into new eras of conflict. That's why we see programs like Sentinel get approval in the first place. Russia and China are developing new ICBMs, and the US can't afford to rely solely on its aging Minuteman III stock. Speaking of China, it's also expanding its nuclear arsenal. NPR reports that it currently has between 400 and 500 nukes that are ready to go, with the Pentagon estimating that it'll be up to 1,500 by 2035. That would bring it in line with Russia and American nuclear numbers, presenting another problem for the future. With an expanded nuclear arsenal, could China become more aggressive in its geopolitical efforts? We might even see a three-way Cold War develop, with America caught in an arms race to stay ahead of both China and Russia, both of which are countries with anti-West sentiments. America will need to keep spending on its military to stay ahead of any threats that might occur in the future. And the volatility of the nature of those threats also means it needs to be adaptable. Nobody could have predicted the war would spark in Ukraine when it did. The same goes for Israel. What about the next conflict? The US can make some educated guesses, but the future will always be uncertain, meaning it has to be prepared for as many possibilities as possible. Reducing funding now cuts those preparation efforts off at the knees. At least that would be the Pentagon's viewpoint, but it's one that many Americans share. At the beginning of this video, we mentioned that the AFSC says that 56% of Americans would support a reduction in military spending. But those are far from the only polling figures available, with others suggesting there's actually a tendency within public sentiment to keep on spending. For instance, Global Affairs reports that 51% of people believe that the U.S. needs to maintain its military superiority to achieve its foreign policy goals. The only method that's considered more effective, 54%, point to maintaining existing alliances, still requiring military spending, as those alliances often rely on America being capable of providing military aid. But perhaps most tellingly, Global Affairs says that 38% of Americans believe that military spending should stay about the same as it is right now, with 29% saying it should be even higher. That's about 2/3 of the population saying that the amount the Pentagon spends shouldn't decrease, even if some of those people likely think that spending should at least become more efficient. So, what have we learned? The simple fact is that America's military spending can't decrease for several reasons. Its rivalry with China, along with the ever-present Russian problem, means that the U.S. can't afford to allow itself to slip behind in terms of military strength. What it has needs to be maintained, and it has to keep spending on new technology to stay ahead of two countries that have clear anti-West sentiments. That spending is inefficient too, thanks to the Pentagon's anti-competitive approach to awarding many of its contracts, resulting in private manufacturers having strangleholds over the technologies they create. The U.S. has to keep spending, and spending big with its current contractors because it has no other option. Add to all of that the country's desire to maintain a global presence, resulting in billions going to the maintenance of overseas military bases, and you get a veritable stew of issues that make it almost impossible for America to spend less on its military, at least in the near future. Of course, we'd also love to hear your opinions. Do you agree with those who believe the U.S. should decrease its spending? Or do you think that ever higher budgets are the key to maintaining America's military supremacy? Share your opinions in the comments section below.